Well, hello, Australia. And you'll see slivers of daylight get darker as this presentation goes on. I'm living in your yesterday. So I hope you will do everything about your today so that my today will be jealous of my yesterday tomorrow. Did that make sense? So it is just completely joyful to be here with you all. I have such deep respect for you and what you've been doing. And to you, Sue and Aaron and your colleagues, thank you for inviting me to take part in this august group. So, hello. As Sue mentioned, I have the privilege and I've had the privilege for the past 15 years of serving as the executive director of a private charitable foundation called the Gregg Foundation. I'm also a founder and co-chair for a learning network called Remake Learning and author of this still fairly new book, When You Wonder, You're Learning. As Sue noted, I'm joining you from Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh is part of the west coast of the east coast in the United States, and that's from where I'm joining you. As I note, I want to begin by saying some notes to you, and mostly I want to say thank you, because I am deeply aware of what you are doing as educators to support not only your students, but also your faculties, your peers, the families, caregivers, and others in your community through not only this pandemic, but also the wrestling of all sorts of injustices and trauma and challenges that families and communities are experiencing. And so we can't say thank you enough to you. I also have come to learn about you in particular, that you as individuals and your colleagues, you're already all in for the kids and for innovative and just robust futures for them. I understand that you are a group that clearly understands, in fact, how readiness has changed and how fundamentally different today's kids are and the ways that they're developing their identities differently, seeking affirmation differently, consuming and producing information differently. I appreciate the mindsets that you already have as individuals and the cultures that you've built in your schools and the community partnerships that you have in place. And still, I have a question for you. And my question is essentially is this: are you really all in? When you think about your students, when you think about your learners, are you part of a web? Are you part of weaving together all of the places where kids learn so that we co-opt those places in good and constructive ways? Schools are still the bedrock for learning, but schools are also the place where kids spend only 14 to 20% of their waking hours. In those other 80% of their waking hours, they're online, they're at home, they're in museums and libraries and schools and playgrounds and parks. And are we doing all we can as communities, as educators who care about learners and learning, to connect all of the places where young people learn? It's been interesting during this pandemic to have gotten to travel the world, as I'm getting a chance to do right now with you. I'm hopeful in some of the words that I'll share today to offer maybe some hard-earned wisdom, if it can even be called wisdom. But for the past 15 years, we've been working to build, as Sue mentioned, a learning ecosystem. Now, I'll be candid to say we didn't set out 15 years ago to build a learning ecosystem. That's not even a phrase we used in late 2006 and early 2007. But we do have some experience as we think about connections, as we think about co-creation, and all of that means, as Michelle spoke yesterday, about partnerships. So much of what I'll share today stems forward from this book, which has been 3 years in the making. And while it's a book about learning, it's also a book that's grounded in the emotional story of Fred Rogers. And here for a moment, I'm just going to stop my screen because I'm so curious before I tell you a little bit about Fred Rogers. Can I just see some hand waves or some thumbs up? How much do you know? Who knows Fred Rogers? Is that a name that resonates for you at all? A few of you, just a few of you, which is expected, right? Because this is an American character, but it's an American icon. So let me tell you a little bit about Fred Rogers. Fred Rogers broadcast on public television, children's media here in the United States for nearly 40 years. There are generations of Americans, and then there are adults and caregivers who care deeply about Fred Rogers and a program called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Fred Rogers is someone who we can now think of as a learning scientist. He had the accident of being born here in Western Pennsylvania. I mention this because he then studied with the likes of Benjamin Spock, Erik Erikson, Margaret McFarland, some giants of child development theory and practice, all of whom happened to be here in Pittsburgh in the 1950s and 60s. He recognized early on in his work that he had to connect whole child development theory and practice with what today we'd call learning sciences. He was a learning engineer. Again, not words attributed to him or certainly even spoken in the, when we look back 50 years ago. But he was a giant, not only of children's television, but a giant of education and learning in this country. And the emotional respect that people have for him is profound. And in fact, just in the past 3 years, we have a best-selling book here in the United States about him. You may have seen the feature film starring Tom Hanks as Fred Rogers, or Morgan Neville's documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor, which is one of the top 5 grossing documentaries here in American film history. So it's Fred Rogers is someone powerful in American popular culture, Canadian too, certainly continental. And I recognize that his work doesn't transcend to the Australian context, but you get a sense of who this person might have been. So the work stems from Fred Rogers. And in the course of my co-author, Ryan Rzeski, and I talking about Fred Rogers, we like to talk about the 14.3 lessons we've learned. Why 14.3? Because 1, 4, 3 were numbers that were powerful to Fred Rogers. There's 1 letter in the word I, 4 letters in the word love, and 3 letters in the word you. And 1, 4, 3 was a numeric way of expressing I love you. And there was a deep sensibility of loving speech and care in Fred Rogers' work. And our 4th lesson that we share of those 14.3 is this sensibility that learning happens everywhere. And here I'll turn squarely to the work that we've been doing over the past 15 years in southwestern Pennsylvania that we call Remake Learning. So what is Remake Learning? Remake Learning itself is an educational network that we like to describe as igniting engaging, relevant, and equitable learning practices for young people. As we think about what constitutes equitable, engaging, and relevant, we are deeply attentive to justice and justice learning. And certainly we think about this work in its universality, and we think about marginalized populations. And for us in this corner of Earth, we talk about learners in poverty, our learners of color, our learners in our rural areas, girls in the STEM fields, and learners with disabilities. Let's back up 15 years, because it was then that partners, people, began coming together in pancake breakfasts and very informal meetings, representing schools, yes, and also representing higher education and charitable organizations and businesses and libraries and museums. And this was a group that had a sensibility that something was fundamentally changing about learning and had some early inklings about the learning sciences, what we were learning about learning itself, and began to understand that we needed to make some different bets as we thought about the design of spaces, the design of instruction and support, the learning experiences in the learning landscape that we wanted to create. Fast forward, it's a network that really began to embrace frameworks and pedagogies of STEM and STEAM learning, of maker-centered learning. There are 27 different phrases and words that we could all describe that capture different niches and nuances of new frameworks of hands-on project-based learning. It's a group that really took structure about 5 years after its founding. And by 2017, there were more than 600 schools, museums, libraries, early learning centers, after-school programs, creative industries, and campuses of higher education, and the thousands of people who are involved in those organizations, somehow involved in Remake Learning. And as we look forward to 22, we'll be celebrating 15 years as a learning educational network. It's a network that's focused on our learners and what our learners need us to do in support of them to build the atmospheres for learning so that they build those mindsets, those dispositions, those knowledges about which Michelle spoke yesterday. Hundreds of educators in and out of school, pre-K through higher education, came together to wordsmith our vision as a region for what it is that we want learners to achieve. And this simple shift of thinking about learners versus students, about talking about learning versus education, has been a profound mindset change in our region. Yes, schools are critically important, but schools are part of a learning landscape. And so when we think about the knowledge, skills, and dispositions, what is it that we want to nurture in our young people? And we try to articulate that because we recognize ultimately that no one organization can solve and support the learning environment that we need for our young people, and that we need to work collectively together, that we need to partner in new and profoundly different ways that are attentive to the learning sciences, that shift power, that yield better outcomes for our young people. And you see it in the types of organizations that come together and in the examples of results that result in fundamentally changed classrooms, thousands of educators participating in peer learning, professional development groups, and really hundreds of thousands of families engaging in some new ways. So with that context, I want to offer 5 lessons learned, 5 provocations. I'll refer to them rather as encouragements. So encouragement number 1, you need to have a playbook ultimately and do the rhythmic work of organizing. Now, I suspect that no one here in their pre-service training or otherwise, maybe a few of you, had community organizing as part of your work. But when we think about a learning landscape, we need to think about the community organizing work that we need to do. Now, that doesn't mean that schools need to suddenly become community organizers. What it means is that partner organizations need to come together in an organized way and really start to develop some rhythms about how we work together differently. We've tried to create a playbook that served our region. And I should note that there's Creative Commons licensing behind this playbook, and it's been a playbook that folks have used in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, and Christchurch, New Zealand. We've learned some lessons about this community organizing in support of community-based learning. And we have 5 really basic strategies that collectively we use, that we talk about in terms of convening and coordinating and championing and catalyzing this work in some fundamentally different ways. All of it focused on some really easy ways so that you as a teacher, you as an administrator, a museum and exhibit designer, a roboticist, an artist, a designer can get involved easily and avail themselves of what it is that Remake Learning offers. As just one example, Remake Learning hosts all sorts of collective working groups around some of these new frameworks and pedagogies. And when we think, for example, about computer science and computational thinking, you have, for example, the Boys and Girls Club working together with the Hampton School District to create an artificial intelligence curriculum that's used now both in and out of school, has attracted the support of public dollars from the state of Pennsylvania, has subsequently attracted corporate support from the PPG Corporation, and really represents that type of partnership that's serving the self-interests of an out-of-school organization, a school and its school district, and in ways that are developmentally appropriate and innovative for them, and that they could never have done on their own differently. My second provocation, we need to elevate community wisdom and leadership. Leadership is a plaza. Leadership comes in all sorts of places. Yes, leadership sometimes comes from the superintendent, administrator, head of school. Sometimes it comes from the physical education teacher. Sometimes it comes from the children's librarian. But we need to create a network where leadership can rise in all sorts of places. And we need to be especially mindful of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. Because probably like you, this is a deeply held belief that this is a moment to wrestle with justice and equity learning. And so I want to share just some concrete examples again of what we've tried to do in this corner of the world, not because we've gotten it perfectly done, but because we're trying. One example is our work to position Black and Latinx educators as partners alongside researchers in rethinking very specific educational outcomes. For example, Andre Samuel, who heads this amazing STEM-focused out-of-school organization, working with a researcher at the University of Pittsburgh to rethink biology curriculum in a way that is more inclusive of Black and Brown students, in a way that they see themselves in instruction and find greater passion and interest in that biology curriculum. It's in the work, for example, of a teacher at the Pittsburgh Public Schools working with a community-based researcher in thinking about centering African education in some new and profound ways that connect better with Black and Brown students. Another group to elevate are our young people. It's something I know that came up yesterday. And we've worked in Remake Learning to host a working group that has really tried to research, identify, and promulgate best practices in youth voice. But it's also about giving over platforms in terms of events for youth-led, youth-designed community events, giving over communications platforms for young people to design, lead, market, present their voices in platforms that reach our community. Also, as we think about elevating community wisdom and really thinking about community-based leadership, it's really about finding those field-based intermediary organizations that represent other components of learning like mentoring or early childhood education, out-of-school time support, arts-based education, because they are part of the leadership hubs, the leadership networks that contribute to the design of a network like Remake Learning. Because ultimately, if we really genuinely want to connect us as adults differently, we've got to find ways to work differently to elevate and support that sense of community learning. So that's my second provocation in terms of elevating wisdom and community voice and recognizing it and welcoming it. A third one is we need to be deliberate as we think about the future, and deliberate about involving everyone, but also appreciating and inviting the expertise of both futurists and learning scientists in the work. It's something that we've tried to do here in our region repeatedly over the past 15 years, working especially with an organization called KnowledgeWorks, which has done incredible work with futurists in identifying signals for the future as we think about the possibilities for what's ahead and the questions that we're asking ourselves about what it is the future might bring. Most recently, during this pandemic, as we look back over the last 18 months, Remake Learning brought together a regional panel focused on the future of learning, representing the cross-sector of organizations like I mentioned earlier, and gave real words to the preferred future that we want for our ever-evolving learning landscape. Things that we feel like have been core to what we've done, and things that felt particularly poignant and relevant as we think about the work right now. So again, let me offer some concrete examples about what that means for education and education leaders in our region. In summer of 2020, Remake Learning published 2 publications looking already at that point to a post-pandemic future we haven't even yet realized and maybe are still farther away from than we realize. But we tried to identify concrete things that we want to bring into the world that are based in something familiar and yet would be new and meaningful to what it is that we're trying to achieve. What if every school had a director of relationships? Now, you might find a position like that in some private schools, but it's certainly not typical, maybe even completely unheard of in a public school setting here in the United States. Yes, there might be counselors, and yes, there are teachers that perform this work, but what if there was a person who 24/7 did nothing but think about the relationships, the social capital that he or she could cultivate for each and every student, and the one who's working and building those partnerships between individual students or the school itself and external organizations in ways that meet the self-interest of all the parties involved and achieve remarkable developmentally appropriate outcomes for everyone involved. 10 years ago, directors of instructional innovation, at least here in the United States, were unheard of. And now it's pretty typical that school districts have a director of instructional innovation. Maybe 10 years from now, we'll talk about directors of relationship as something completely normal. And wouldn't that be amazing? We've tried to invest too in RMD as a network. Part of what Remake Learning does and offers are grants that are catalytic. And in fact, tens of millions of dollars have been invested over the past 15 years, amassed from private companies, from philanthropic sources, and increasingly lately from public sources. So as we thought about this post-pandemic future, how could we fund some moonshots and really ground ourselves in innovative and just learning? To give you just one example of a project that was funded, the California Area School District, hardly thought of in our region as a well-resourced district, certainly not one thought of at the forefront of learning, It's one that's pretty far to the south of Pittsburgh, at the far exurbs of our metro area. And here is a district that has embraced this opportunity and is thinking about applying a typical practice of individual education plans, typical used in terms of disability education, and really said, you know, if we're serious about personalized learning, how could we use IEPs, as they're known, and as you might know, for every student? And what would that look like? And how do we draw in some Montessori learning from the Early Learning Center? How do we draw in some external partnerships that would supplement this? What would that look like in some serious ways? A library asking differently about how do we expand what it is that we offer in terms of library services? Not just providing pop-up libraries, as outstanding as that might be, but really thinking about a library service system that is embedded and connected to childcare facilities in our region, among other places. Fast forward a year, and just this past summer, Remake Learning pulled together a regional and statewide Pennsylvania panel on innovative teaching and learning. There were more than 1,000 teachers, more than 200 administrators who took part across the state of Pennsylvania in deep listening sessions in identifying our preferred future and the building blocks of what we want for learning on the other side of this pandemic. We ultimately framed it in the context of justice, methods, and relationships. And again, tried to push ourselves to identify immediate and long-term actions as we think about the things that we might achieve. How we do work better to connect out-of-school providers with in-school providers. How we develop district-level plans for communicating with families differently. And in the long term, how we think differently about a regional family engagement support system as one example. We already have a robust system of family support systems, but we don't have a family engagement support system in the way documented in this report. We thought too about methods and instruction of what happens in the classroom or in the school setting generally, and the things that we might do on the other side of this pandemic. And as we think about relationships, what are the things that we do in the design of spaces? Asking ourselves questions, for example, how students are made more or less human, not only by spaces, but by the adults in those spaces. And thinking about the things, again, that we can do in the short and long term. I mentioned this work because we've connected this work locally to some national work across the United States led by AASA, which is the National Superintendents Association here in the United States, which in April of this year published a vision of learning called Learning 2025, a student-centered, equity-focused vision of learning. In our region, 32 school districts representing nearly 80,000 students have come forward to say, we want to collectively work together as a peer group and separately as school districts in realizing and really wrestling with systemic change, recognizing that systemic change isn't guaranteed merely because of some innovations over these past 18 months. And what is the work that we can do now to realize serious systemic change as we think about equity, innovative, focused learning for our young people that takes advantage of the learning landscape. These 32 school districts are urban, rural, suburban, and half of the students in these districts would be considered impoverished. My fourth encouragement of 5, seriously engage parents, families, and caregivers. One of the things I believe so deeply about this pandemic is that this is a new opportunity to engage parents, families, and caregivers as learning allies in some fundamentally different ways, building upon the empathy, at least from the early part of the pandemic, that parents grew to have about teachers and educators and what it is that teachers and educators in and out of school, early childhood throughout high school are actually doing. So again, let me share some very concrete examples. We have a project underway in our region involving a media platform called kidsburg.org, working with a design firm out of San Francisco, 100 innovation education platform out of Helsinki, Finland, and the Brookings Institution in Washington, DC. This is a project called Parents as Allies, finding ways that administrators and parents can work together to support parent-family engagement differently going forward. 2 concrete examples from schools you've never heard of and probably shouldn't, I mean, it doesn't matter, but they're phenomenal schools like your own, right? The New Brighton area school district right outside of Pittsburgh, using that ideal empathy-driven design approach to wrestle with the ways that they want to engage parents differently, and really began to focus on fathers and how they can involve fathers differently in elementary education in the New Brighton area school district. A group of parents and teachers, again, conducting more than 100 empathy interviews in the Hopewell School District, and in a largely predominantly white school district, wrestling with what it means to introduce diversity, equity, inclusionary curriculum, books, other materials in the instruction and in their classrooms as we go about this work. This partnership, Parents as Allies, is hosting a whole series of great learning conversations as we think about all of the ways that we could forge partnerships here in the case among parents, families, and caregivers and our schools to support one another differently so that parents feel better engaged with their schools, but teachers and educators really regard parents as stronger, more trustworthy, more engaged learning allies to the work that they're doing in the professional settings of their classrooms and schools. A third example comes from Remake Learning itself and a learning innovation festival we call Remake Learning Days. Remake Learning is very much focused on teachers and practitioners in and out of school. And we wrestled 5 or 6 years ago with the question of how do we seriously engage parents, families, and caregivers and help parents and families and caregivers understand how learning is being remade, how to support their children in their care in some fundamentally different ways, and then really how to build demand among parents, families, and caregivers for new approaches to learning. Remake Learning Days is a regional festival that takes advantage of all of the assets in our learning landscape, really focusing on our young people. And it's work that's expanded not only from southwestern Pennsylvania, but to places like the state of Oregon, San Diego County in California, from eastern Appalachia and eastern Kentucky to our national capital in Washington, D.C. This is really about celebrating our progress and about engaging parents, families, and caregivers in some fundamentally different ways. Which leads to my fifth and last encouragement, and that is to invest deeply in storytelling. This is something that I absolutely did not appreciate in the early years of Remake Learning, about how much we needed to invest financially and otherwise in storytelling. Bottom line, we do a bad job in education in telling our story, and we allow other people to tell our stories. And so we've had to think differently about how we invest time and money in supporting storytelling workshops and communications experts and others in working with educators. And not only in unearthing the stories, but in then telling the stories. And by telling stories, I mean not only media, but really the ways that we engage with parents, families, and caregivers, what it is that we're producing, what it is that we're showcasing, how it is that we're telling the story of the extraordinary work that you do. I mention this too because we think about this in the collective context. And Remake Learning in March of 2020 launched a regional campaign we called Remake Tomorrow. The campaign launched with this video.
You've probably been thinking about the future a lot lately. About how our world is changing. About whether a robot could do your job. About how the way you get to work or shop for food or unwind at the end of the day is changing. About what kind of a world future generations will inherit. We've made it through uncertain tomorrows before. That's because we've never stopped wondering, and we've never given up hope. Today, we know more than we ever have. About how to solve problems. About how our brains develop. About how to stay grounded in what makes us human while exploring the frontiers of what humans can make. The future holds tremendous promise. Promise that we can find the potential inside any learner. Promise that together we can nurture that potential in each and every child. Promise that we can let loose the brilliance of an entire generation. That future is closer than you think. But to make a better tomorrow, we have to act today. Let's forge a future that holds promise for every young person. Let's connect timeless ideas with new ways of learning. Let's prepare for what comes next no matter what tomorrow brings. Learn more at remakelearning.org/tomorrow.
This is a campaign supported by stories and articles and blogs, by podcasts, online events, extensive videography, in-person events, and lots of grant making. It's a campaign that achieved unexpectedly great results when you just look at those numbers in terms of tens of millions of marketing impressions. To me, the more important number is 60,000 actual people engaging in the campaign, sharing articles, commenting, actually participating. I mention this work because this is work that can't and shouldn't fall to any school or school district. This is work that can only be achieved collectively if collectively in our regions, in our countries and otherwise, we're going to achieve a different mindset about learning. Because it's those mindsets that, as you know so well, will prompt entirely different behaviors in support of learners and the education settings we're trying to achieve. This is work that we advanced in this year, and tomorrow, today, we launched the fall and final edition of the Remaking Tomorrow campaign. And you're the first people anywhere in the world to see this 90-second clip that'll launch tomorrow's campaign.
What do you wonder when you wonder about tomorrow? Do you wonder what you'll do or where you'll go? Who you'll meet or who you'll become? Or do you wonder how you'll be seen or how you'll be cared for? About whether you'll be hungry or housed or safe? As parents and educators, as caregivers and neighbors, we know that what we wonder about matters. We know it's on us to build a tomorrow where each day holds promise for every child. Where learning starts with the needs, the hopes, and the questions that young people bring. Where every kid can explore what excites them, what challenges them, what moves them. A tomorrow where community and belonging, justice and joy go hand in hand and define what learning can be. Powered by Remake Learning, Tomorrow calls us to forge this future together, to take what we've learned from these difficult times and to build something better, to build places of learning that spark wonder for every child, to summon the imagination and the courage to leave normal behind, and shoot for the moon instead. For them. What comes next is up to us. Visit remakelearning.org/tomorrow.
For all of our data, for all of our research, for all of our evidence, it's ultimately the power of storytelling and the emotion of storytelling that'll drive the things it is that we want to achieve. Which leads me actually to my encore. This is cheating. This is my encore encouragement, which is really to document the work that you're doing separately and collectively. Again, something that I did not appreciate, but the importance of documenting it in all sorts of ways to uplift, to spotlight, to provide cover, and to build that institutional memory as a community begins to invest in a learning ecosystem differently. And all of this is available to you at remakelearning.org or Remake Learning Days. You can also find most of it on your favorite social media platforms. And so my question to you, as you're all in, are you all in building and forging and maintaining the partnerships that will really allow our learners themselves to connect across all of the places where they might learn? And so in closing, I return to my hero and an American hero, Fred Rogers. And as we shared in our book, and as we share in our lesson 14.3, I love you, add a little bit of love to the world. And at the turn of the millennium, just before his death, Fred Rogers offered this challenge. Try your best to make goodness attractive. It's one of the toughest assignments you'll ever be given. So you know what the purpose of learning is, and you know that it's far nobler than preparing future workers. It's about raising creative, curious, caring kids, citizens who can build stronger, more just and inclusive communities, and ultimately a loving world. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm completely frightened of the forthcoming hot seat, and it is a complete joy to be with you all in this setting. So thank you.